Hello everyone, this will be a very simple ASMR video where I'll tell you about the history and the astronomy behind the flag of Brazil. So you've probably seen this flag before. It consists of a green field, a yellow diamond or a rhombus, and the starry field, the circle representing the sky. So where does this come from? Why these stars like this, disposed like this? What is going on here? Well, the idea of using stars on a field in the flag originated as an evolution of an older symbol. So for example, you can see this symbol in the flag of Portugal currently. So this circle in the flag of Portugal is called an armillary sphere and used to be a navigational instrument that the European, especially Portuguese, navigators used when they were exploring and colonizing the world. Very quickly, this symbol became associated with Brazil. This was the first flag that Brazil actually had when it was still a colony. The Kingdom of Brazil, it was called. But then in 1815, Brazil and Portugal actually were united into one country, which was called the United Kingdom, with capital in Rio. So this is the flag of the United Kingdom, this is the arms of Portugal, and then the armillary sphere is there, representing Brazil. Not much afterwards, Brazil became independent, and an independent monarchy. So this is the flag of the Empire of Brazil that existed since 1822 until 1889. We can already see the green and the yellow of the current flag. These had dynastic origins, so the green represented one royal family, one royal house, and the yellow a different one, which were united in marriage. But the armillary sphere is right there. And then of course the current flag, which was established by the Republicans when the Republic was established in 1889, they wanted to change the symbol from that very monarchical one to something more scientific. So they wanted to represent the actual sky instead of that instrument which represents the sky. So why not represent the actual sky? So what exactly is going on here? So we may have to go into some astronomy. So this is what an armillary sphere actually looks like. So it's a series of spheres and rings, and the Earth itself is represented inside. So the armillary sphere sort of represents the sky around the Earth, as if you're watching and looking at the sky from the outside. You have the signs of the zodiac, which is the ecliptic, and these things can move, and then you can find some measurements, and then this can be useful. So what this is representing is what is called the celestial sphere. The celestial sphere is an imaginary sphere where we imagine all the stars to be attached to. So just like a globe represents the land, on a sphere, on the outside of a sphere. The celestial sphere represents the stars on the inside of the sphere. And that way we could map the stars using normal coordinates, just like we do with a map. So the idea of a celestial sphere is ancient. That was before people knew that the stars were not all exactly the same distance from the Earth. But this has continued in representations because it's so practical. So this is a map showing the Portuguese discoveries and colonies. So it shows that they were the first to sail around Africa to get to Asia for trade and for spices, and they settled and colonized several places, but of course the biggest one was Brazil. So you have to try to imagine that from a Portuguese point of view, navigation itself was almost a Portuguese invention, and Brazil was sort of the jewel in the crown of the Portuguese crown. This is actually something they used to say, because it was the biggest and the most profitable colony. So that's why the armillary sphere became associated with Brazil. Firstly, by being the personal flag, the personal symbol of King Manuel, which was the king that started off the discoveries. So he started using this as his personal symbol, and then it just became associated with the discoveries, with the colonies, and with Brazil. Right, so why does this matter so much? Why does it apply to navigation? Well, it's very difficult to navigate in open ocean when you have nothing to base yourself. So in the northern hemisphere, above the equator, so for the Portuguese this would be on the North Atlantic, a way that you would know your latitude would be by finding Polaris, right? So Polaris is right at the top of the Earth, directly up north. So the axis of rotation of the Earth points to Polaris all the time. So this is very practical. So it doesn't matter where you are, north will always be pointing to Polaris. So how does that help? Here we can see a map of the sky. As I said, you can trace coordinates. This is the constellation of Ursa Minor, and then it shows that Polaris is here, and very close to this, which is the North Pole. Not on land, of course, but this is what we would call the North Celestial Pole. The consequence of this is because the Earth spins around this axis, all the stars appear to rotate around the North Star or the Pole Star. And that's why we call this one Polaris. So as you can see, it sort of looks like it stands still and all the stars rotate around it. This is of course a long exposure photograph, but if you look at the sky for several minutes, you would start to see this. I don't remember exactly where this picture was taken, but definitely in the northern hemisphere, where we can see the northern pole star. So what information does that give us? Well, it will tell us your latitude. So just to revise, what is latitude? So you may see on a map or on a globe, this is the equator, and this is the Greenwich meridian that passes through London that we have decided is 0 degrees, right? 0 degrees longitude, but the equator is 0 degrees latitude, and then it increases all the way to the North Pole, which is 90 degrees. So if you haven't stopped to think about it, the reason why they are degrees is because the Earth is a sphere, of course. So the idea is that imagine an angle between the center of the Earth, one side at the equator, and the other side in a specific point on the surface of the Earth. So if you are around London, which would be about 50 degrees latitude, it means that there's an angle between the equator, the center of the Earth, and the position of London, which is 50 degrees, right? So that's what latitude means. It's literally an angle on a ball. So Polaris can help you because your latitude is always going to be the same as the altitude of the star in your sky. So here's this little person, this little fella is standing on the North Pole. As we know, the North Pole is 90 degrees from the equator, and the star is 90 degrees above the horizon. Wherever you are on the Earth, you can always see exactly half of the celestial sphere. You may think that this little person cannot see, for example, this bit here because of the Earth, but obviously this is just a diagram. The Earth is extremely small compared to the celestial sphere, which is really far away. So it makes no difference if you're standing on the surface or if you were in the center of the Earth. It makes no difference to your perspective. So that's why the horizon, when you are standing on the North Pole, is exactly half of the celestial sphere, and Polaris will be overhead all the time, every day, even during the day, which in the North Pole lasts 6 months in summer, of course. But now, if you are somewhere else, so let's imagine that you are here, and this is London. Now your horizon cuts a different angle of the celestial sphere, right? There are different stars, different parts of the sky that you can see. It's still half, of course. Now, when you look at Polaris and you measure the horizon, the altitude in degrees between Polaris and the horizon, that will be exactly the same number of degrees as your latitude on the Earth, right? So if Polaris is 50 degrees above the horizon, that means that you are at latitude 50 degrees, which is about the location of London. You would use this instrument, which is called a sextant. It's a very precise instrument. You look through here and then you can measure exactly how many degrees between any sky object and the horizon. This can also be done with the sun, but of course not at night. At night you need to use the Polaris. Now, think about it. What happens if you go to the southern hemisphere now? If we go back here, right, as you can imagine, this little guy is here and Polaris is right there. But if this person went south of the equator, the line of the horizon would be like this, and Polaris would be invisible, would be below the horizon. It would be in the invisible half of the celestial hemisphere. So now you cannot see Polaris anymore. But of course, now you can see the other pole. This picture was taken in Chile and is also a long exposure photograph showing the sky spinning around the pole. But look, there's nothing inside the pole, at least nothing that is readily visible. And this is a long exposure photo, so a lot of these stars are not even that bright if you see them with the naked eye. So there's no star which is bright enough in the center and the actual south celestial pole. So that creates a problem when you're trying to navigate to the South Atlantic, to Brazil for example. Well, luckily, they found this. Different stars that are also useful. So these stars here, they create a cross like this. And this is called the Southern Cross. And this was very useful and very beautiful, very bright, very easy to see. And this was a constellation, a collection of stars that Europeans did not know. So when they started to sail south of the equator and they found this, it was very useful. These stars as well, extremely bright, very useful. This one, for example, it's Alpha Centauri, which is the closest star to the Sun, only 4 light years away. So why is this constellation so useful and important? Here, just so you see, the Latin name is crux, the cross, and it sort of is inside the constellation of Centaurus, which is like a man-horse kind of thing, as you can see. And these are very bright stars in the constellation Centaurus. Well, the way it works is that people realize that if you see the Southern Cross and you imagine a line going along and extending from the cross, especially if you use these, which are called the pointer stars, which was the Alpha and Beta Centauri that we saw. If you use these as well and imagine a line coming here, this will be extremely close to the actual South Pole, the celestial South Pole. These things here are the Magellanic Clouds. They're actually galaxies, but they are visible with the naked eye. But at the time they didn't know there were galaxies, of course. There is a star which is very close to the pole. It's the closest star to the pole, but it's very faint. It's not very bright, so that's why it's not useful. And that's why navigators use the Southern Cross. As you can remember, we could not see this star on the southern hemisphere sky. So this is the map of the sky of the southern pole. So crux is here, the Southern Cross, and it sort of points towards here, which is the southern pole, Centaurus. And as you can see, a lot of these stars have and constellations have some funny names. So Mensa literally means the table. So there's a constellation of table. This constellation here is just called Triangle. And there are other strange constellations that are named after objects or instruments. Whereas Centaurus is obviously a mythological character, right? So why are some of these constellations so boring? Well, you have to remember that Europeans couldn't see those stars. So for example, the constellation Southern Cross is not visible at all at any point north of this line. Most of the constellations as we know them and the signs of the zodiac, they are part of an Eurasian culture. So they started out with the Babylonians. They invented most of what we know, the constellations and the 360 degrees on the sphere, and the Greeks adopted those. But then the question is, if they didn't know, if Europeans didn't know about the constellation Southern Cross, how did Greeks were able to give a mythological name for Centaurus? And they're very close to each other, they're next to each other. Well, the truth is that it used to be visible. So the point from which you can see a constellation changes over time, but very slowly. And the reason for that is because the direction where the North Pole points changes over time like this. So over time, the northern hemisphere will point to a different place in the sky. Nowadays it points at Polaris, but over thousands and thousands of years it will point somewhere else. So about 100 years in the Common Era, when Ptolemy he wrote the most basic and influential astronomical treatise from the ancient times, he was in Alexandria, right here on the north coast of Egypt. At that time, the Southern Cross was visible from where he was. It's not anymore, as you can see, because he has changed. But he decided that the Southern Cross was part of Centaurus. Obviously, he wouldn't associate the cross symbol with anything. This was extremely important then, so you have to imagine that the Europeans were traveling south into the South Atlantic and rediscovering a set of stars that had been visible almost 2,000 years ago um, by Europeans, by Greek and Hellenic society, such as in Turkey and northern Egypt. So this is a drawing that an astronomer, a Portuguese astronomer, drew, and he was in the ship that discovered Brazil, right? This is usually what they say when the Europeans arrive somewhere, that they discovered a place. So he did a simple drawing of the Southern Cross and he sent this to the king, of course. And this information about how to navigate, actual maps of the sky, of the land, these were state secrets. Knowing where things were was extremely important, and countries actually had spies, breaking into castles and palaces to steal maps at that time. So then you can imagine and you can understand why this constellation became so associated with the southern hemisphere, with the South Atlantic, and then consequently with Brazil. So when the Republic was established in 1889, like I said, the Republicans wanted to replace the flag with a more scientific symbol. So they decided to represent the actual sky. So this is what the sky actually looked like on the 15th of November 1889 over Rio, which was the capital of Brazil at the time. And they decided to represent some of the brightest stars that are represented there. And you can see that the Southern Cross is here and is pointing south to this thing. It's called CSP, which means the Southern Celestial Pole. So the stars that are in pink are the stars they decided to include. So stars in Scorpios, Southern Cross, the Triangulum, the Southern Pole Star itself, even though it's tiny, Virgo, Canis Major, however, you have to remember that in the armillary sphere, you're seeing the sky from outside of the celestial sphere. So all the constellations would be flipped because you're seeing, let's say, a transparent celestial sphere from the outside. So as you can see, I've mirrored this image. And now, if you maybe are familiar with the flag of Brazil, you can start to recognize. So the stars on the flag of Brazil, so here's the Southern Cross, and here's the Southern Cross. They are flipped in relation to what they would actually have looked like in the sky. Also, just like the Earth is not a map and it's not flat, representations of the Earth are always a bit distorted, right? So the way that the stars curve on the side is slightly different from what you would get on a more scientific, but these are the stars. So the idea is that each star represents a state in Brazil, and there's a logic for which star represents what. The cool thing is that when the Republic was proclaimed, there were fewer states in Brazil. Some states were created later by dividing a state, so when this happened, they would add, and they did add, other stars. Again, going back to this, and is choosing another star to be represented in the flag. So there are rules about how to draw the flag, and so basically you would find a grid to know where to put the stars. It's very difficult to draw the flag accurately. So as I said, there's a logic to which states are represented by which stars. There is an attempt, it's not 100% fail-safe, but there is an attempt to represent states that are in the same region of Brazil as belonging to the same constellation. So here you see the three states in the south region of Brazil are represented by Triangulum. This constellation has 3 stars and it's very, very south. One of the southernmost constellations in the sky. These letters are the abbreviations of the names of the states. So I'm sorry if you don't know them, but there really was no space to write the full name of the states. So the constellations that are represented are Scorpius, Triangle. There's a southern triangle. There's another constellation called Triangle. Octantis, that's the name of the constellation. Carina, so the only one star from Carina. Canis Major, Canis Minor, so the big dog and the small dog. Hydra, which is like a sea monster, I think. The Southern Cross itself, and Virgo, one star of Virgo. So there is certain logic going on here. So this represents a very big state which has, especially at the time when the flag was created, had the most of its territory in the northern hemisphere, actually, because Brazil straddles the hemisphere. So this band and the star above it sort of suggests this country that is very far south but has a little bit over the halfway, and it is of course a further north star compared to the others, right? Sao Paulo, the state, is right here, which you could claim is the most prominent star in the flag, but it is the state with the largest population. And they chose a specific time of day to choose a representation of the sky when the Southern Cross looks like it's vertical, right? So it looks like it's pointing very clearly. Because remember, the stars would spin around like this, right? If you're facing south, this would be east, right? So the stars would spin like this around the pole. So at different times, the Southern Cross would look tilted, but they chose this specific time because it looks neat and vertical. The Southern Cross, as I was saying, became and has become an extremely popular and powerful symbol of the Southern Hemisphere. So, for example, um, it has also been used as the cover of the Brazilian passport. But this is an old cover, they have already changed it. But they've placed the Southern Cross here, and this shape sort of suggests the shape of the Earth. And if you imagine that the Earth would be separated here, it sort of suggests the position of Brazil on the Earth, and also the shape a little bit, right, of Brazil. So this is a very neat coincidence. This constellation is also famous for other uses. So it is in the flag of Australia, right here, and also on the flag of New Zealand. They decided to represent fewer stars, not the middle one. So here is a globe where you can see where Brazil is placed on the actual planet. So this is the equator, so some of Brazil is above the equator and then in the northern hemisphere, but most of it is coming down almost to Antarctica. So then, why did they decide to represent that central star that is barely visible? Because they did, right? So if we go back, the star that represents the southern pole is the Federal District, TF. The Federal District is not a state, but it's one of the federal units. And as I said, all the stars seem to spin around this. And the Federal District is where the capital is. At the time, the capital was Rio, right? And there was a federal district around Rio in the 1889, right? So that's why it was so important that this was the sky of Rio. So he creates this idea of all the other stars and all the other states circling around the capital and together creating the federation, because Brazil is a federation. Nowadays the capital is Brasilia, of course, and there's a federal district around it, but the point still stands. All the stars and all the states, they sort of collaborate, and then together they sort of pinpoint the center, which would represent the union, the federation. So here we are back to the present day flag. So I hope this was interesting and informative. Now you know a little bit about the history of why they decided to make the flag like this and what these stars represent, right? So if you imagine this as a globe, regardless if you want to see it as a celestial globe, it sort of suggests a specific place and time for Brazil, a specific place on the surface of the planet, because these stars only look like this from a specific place, but also a specific point in history, because as we were saying, over hundreds and hundreds of years, the stars change position and they change their visibility. So the Southern Cross, as being a southern constellation, is something that is only a fact for the relative presence, not 2,000 years ago. But not only that, it also connects Brazil to the history of European discoveries in the celestial hemisphere and astronomy. So this is the history and the science behind the flag of Brazil. Let me know if you enjoyed this or if you have any other questions. Thank you.